There are questions that are not really questions. There are things that arrive wearing the costume of curiosity, framed with a raised inflection at the end, delivered with the casual ease of someone who believes they are simply asking something they want to know that are not, underneath the framing, curiosity at all. They are assumptions. They are the sound of someone looking at a group of people and deciding, before they have learned a single thing about any of them, that the group is interchangeable. That the individuals inside it are not individuals. That whatever marks them as visually similar to a person who has never looked carefully is more important than anything that marks them as specific, particular, irreplaceable human beings with separate histories and separate minds and separate lives that have nothing to do with each other, except that they share a zip code on someone else's category system. This is a story about one of those non-questions. About a family who heard it and chose how to respond. About a host who made sure the room understood what had just happened. And about why what Steve Harvey said in that studio on that afternoon was not, in the end, about a game show at all, but about something that most of us encounter in some form, and that most of us have, at one time or another, needed someone to address out loud in front of everyone. Hit that like button and subscribe right now before we go any further, because stories that name the things that usually get left unnamed are exactly what this channel is here for, and we bring one every single week. Now let us talk about the Park family and what happened on that stage. The Park family from Irvine, California, arrived at the Family Feud studio in the winter of 2024 carrying, like all great families, considerably more than they were about to show. They were a family that had been built across 2 countries and 3 generations through the specific combination of work and sacrifice and refusal and love that immigration at its most successful tends to require. Not the glossy, compressed version of that story that gets told in retrospectives, but the actual version. With the early mornings, and the language barriers, and the jobs that were below your credential level, and the children who translated for their parents, in situations where the power dynamic of that was not lost on anyone, and the slow, generational construction of something that started as survival and became, over time, flourishing. The team captain was 45-year-old James Park, who had grown up in Koreatown in Los Angeles, and who was now a pediatric dentist in Irvine with a practice he had built from a single chair in a rented office to a 3-chair clinic with a staff of 7 and a wait list of 2 months. He had his parents' discipline and their absolute refusal to accept a ceiling that someone else had decided was appropriate for them, and he had channeled both of those qualities into a career that was, by every measure, exactly what his parents had crossed an ocean hoping for. His wife Jenny, 43, had a story that mirrored James's in structure if not in every detail. Her parents had come from Vietnam in the early 1990s, part of the second wave of Vietnamese immigration that had followed the first wave of refugees who arrived after the fall of Saigon. They had settled in Orange County, which had the largest Vietnamese American community in the United States, and they had built, again with the same combination of discipline and refusal and morning after morning commitment, a life that had given Jenny the specific opportunity of choosing, rather than simply surviving. She was a software engineer at a technology company in Irvine, and she was, by the account of everyone who had ever worked with her, the person you called when the problem was genuinely hard, and when getting it wrong had actual consequences. Her eldest son Daniel, 20, was in his second year at UC Berkeley studying electrical engineering. Her daughter Sophie, 17, was in her junior year of high school with the specific calm, focused energy of a young woman who knows where she is going and is not in a hurry about it because she has done the math, and the math is fine. The 5th team member was James's mother, 74-year-old Sunyi, who had come from South Korea in 1978 when James was not yet born, and who had spent 46 years building a life in California that she described, when asked in her warm-up with Steve Harvey, as pretty good considering. Steve Harvey had laughed at that. He had repeated it to the audience. He had said, "Pretty good considering. That is the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me on this stage." Sunyi had looked at him with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has been telling the truth her whole life, and is pleased that it continues to land. She was the kind of elderly woman who makes a room feel anchored, not because she dominated it or performed for it, but because she was entirely at ease within it, in the way that people are at ease when they have been through enough that a television studio is genuinely just another room. She spoke English with an accent that was itself a history, the sound of someone who had learned a language in their 30s and had then spent 40 years using it every day in a country that had required her to, and who had made it hers without losing the sounds underneath it that told you where she had started. The competing family that day was the Miller family from Indianapolis, Indiana. 5 of them, a father, a mother, 2 adult sons, and a daughter-in-law who had the easy, expansive confidence of a family whose entire social world had, for their entire lives, been populated primarily by people who looked like them, and who had therefore arrived at their middle years with a very detailed understanding of certain things and a very limited exposure to certain others. This was not, in itself, a moral failing. Most people grow up in some version of the same geographic and social homogeneity, in varying degrees. What matters is what you do with the limitations of that homogeneity when the world outside it becomes visible, whether you approach the difference with curiosity and the assumption of full humanity, or with something that stops short of that. The team captain was 52-year-old Richard Miller, who owned a landscaping business and who had the broad, friendly energy of a man who liked people and was good with people in the specific context of people he had spent a lifetime understanding. He was not malicious. He was not calculating. He was someone who had absorbed a very particular set of habits of mind about certain kinds of people over a lifetime of limited exposure, and who had not yet had the occasion to examine those habits carefully enough to understand what they were actually saying. His sons were quick and competitive. His wife was warm and funny. The family was, by every first impression, a reasonable and likable group of people who had shown up for a good time. The pregame went warmly. Steve Harvey spent time with both families, drawing out the details and the personalities that would make the audience feel connected to the people on stage. He was clearly charmed by Soon-Yi, who gave Steve a one-sentence biography of herself that contained more information per word than most people manage in a paragraph, and delivered it with the dry economy of someone who does not see the point of using more words than the situation requires. He spent time with Daniel, who explained what he was studying with the focused enthusiasm of a young man who is doing exactly what he wants to be doing and knows it. He talked to Sophie, who impressed him with an answer that was both funnier and more perceptive than he had expected, which he acknowledged directly, and which Sophie received with the composed pleasure of someone who is accustomed to exceeding expectations and considers this a reasonable baseline. The Park family was, from the first minutes of their presence on that stage, vivid and specific and entirely individual, 5 people with 5 distinct personalities, 5 distinct voices, 5 distinct ways of engaging with Steve Harvey and with the room. The first round started. Both families played competitively and well. The audience was engaged. The score was close. Richard Miller was strong at the buzzer. Jenny was quick and accurate. Daniel had the fast, confident answer delivery of a young man who grew up in a household where both dinner conversation and academic standards were high, and who has consequently developed excellent instincts for both pattern recognition and the specific art of saying the right thing fast. Soon-Yi gave an answer in the first round that hit number 2 on the board, and received it with the expression of someone who is merely confirming what she already expected. It was in the brief transition between the first and second rounds that Richard Miller said it. He was looking at the Park family. He was looking at them in the slightly unfocused way of someone who is thinking about the game and letting his eyes rest on the opposing side rather than actively attending to the individuals there. And then he said it to his son beside him at the conversational volume of a man who believes he is having a private exchange, in the specific register of genuine puzzlement rather than malice, which in some ways made it worse rather than better, because the puzzlement meant he had looked at this family and found them, in their distinctness, less visible than the thing he had decided unified them. He said, with the candor of the genuinely confused, "I don't get it. How do they all look so similar?" Like, how do you tell them apart? He said it without hostility. He said it without any awareness that it would land the way it did. He said it the way someone says something they have thought many times before and have never been given a reason to examine. Daniel heard it. He was 20 years old, and he had been hearing the bones of this question in its many forms for his entire conscious life. He had been hearing it in school hallways and in college dining halls, and in the half-second looks that people gave him and his family in certain rooms, the look that said, "I see your category before I see you." He received it with the controlled composure of someone who has a practiced relationship with this specific kind of erasure, not because it stops being uncomfortable, but because experience teaches you what you can and cannot do with the anger it produces in a situation like this one, and he had learned. Jenny heard it and looked at James. James heard it and was still for a moment, the specific stillness of a man who has been in rooms like this before and who is making, in real time, the calculation that most people who have experienced this kind of thing make in real time. Is this the moment? And if it is, what does this moment call for? Soon ye heard it. She looked at Steve Harvey with the patient expression of someone who has decided that the response to this particular thing is not hers to give, and that she will wait for the person whose job it is to give it. Steve Harvey had heard it. He stood with it for a moment, not a long moment, not a deliberate pause, but the brief internal second of someone confirming that what they heard is what they heard, and deciding what they are going to do about it. Then he moved to center stage with the calm, unhurried purpose of a man who knows exactly what the next few minutes are going to contain. "Hold on," he said, not to any specific person, to the room, as instruction and as statement simultaneously. He turned to Richard Miller. He looked at him with the measured attention of someone taking an accurate reading of a situation before responding to it. Then he said, "I heard something just now that I want to address, because this is my stage, and I am responsible for what happens here, and I am not going to continue without saying what I'm about to say." Richard Miller's easy confidence had shifted into the more uncertain register of a man who was only now beginning to understand that his private observation had been received in a different way than it had been sent. "A question was just asked," Steve said, "about why this family looks similar. About how you tell them apart." He said it plainly, in the same words Richard had used without euphemism, because the clarity of naming it accurately was itself a form of response. "And I want to address it directly because I think it came from a place of genuine curiosity rather than bad intention. And I want to use the fact that it was genuine, to say something that I think is worth saying." He turned toward the Park family. He looked at all of them. "Let me tell you what I see when I look at this family," he said. "I see a man who built a dental practice from a single chair to a clinic with a wait list of 2 months. I see a woman who is the person her colleagues call when the problem is genuinely hard. I see a young man at Berkeley studying engineering who gave me one of the sharpest answers I've heard in a pregame in a long time. I see a young woman who made me laugh and impressed me at the same time, which is very hard to do." He looked at Soon Yi, "And I see a woman who has been in this country for 46 years and described her life as pretty good considering, which is the best answer to a question I've ever heard." He looked back at the room. "These are 5 individual people," he said. "They are different from each other in every way that matters. They have different personalities and different careers and different ways of being in the world. The only way you get to the question of why they all look the same is if you looked at them and stopped at the surface. If you never got past the first thing you noticed to any of the things underneath it." He turned back to Richard, and his voice was not cold, but it was completely direct. "I'm not saying you're a bad person. I don't believe you are. But I'm asking you to understand that question, how do they all look the same? How do you tell them apart? That question says, I looked at these people and saw a category, not individuals. And every one of the people standing over there deserves to be seen as an individual. Every one of them is one." The studio was quiet in the specific way it goes quiet when something true has been said that the room needed to hear and is now absorbing. Richard Miller looked at the Park family. He looked at James, he looked at Jenny, he looked at Daniel and Sophie and Sunyi. He looked at them in the slow, deliberate way of someone who is trying to do the thing he had just been invited to do, to look past the first thing, to find the people underneath the category. It was visible. The trying was visible, he said without performing the apology, simply stating it. "I apologize for that, that wasn't right." Steve Harvey nodded once. Then he looked at the Park family. "I want to ask you something," he said. He looked at Sunyi specifically. "How do you want to proceed?" Sunyi looked at him, then she looked at her family. Then she looked back at Steve Harvey with the expression of a woman who has heard this kind of thing before, who has been making decisions about how to proceed in the face of it for 46 years, and who has arrived at a very clear and durable answer to that question. She said, "We proceed by winning." Steve Harvey smiled. It was the slow, genuine smile of a man who has just heard the right answer delivered by the right person. He looked at the audience. The audience was already responding, not with performed enthusiasm, but with the real, warm sound of a room that has just watched a 74-year-old woman reduce the entire situation to its correct dimensions. He looked back at Sunyi and said, "Yes, ma'am, that is exactly how we proceed." The Park family played the rest of the game with the specific clarity of people who have just been seen accurately in a room that had, for a moment, failed to see them, and who have decided that the correct response to being seen is to show up fully. James was quick and precise, giving answers with the decisive confidence of a man who has spent 20 years making good decisions under the scrutiny of patients and staff, and his own high standards. Jenny was excellent, technically sharp, fast, accurate in the way of someone whose entire professional life has rewarded getting things right on the first pass. Daniel played with the loose intelligence of a Berkeley sophomore who has stopped being surprised by his own ability but has not yet lost his delight in it. Sophie, when she got to the buzzer, gave an answer so accurate and so immediate that Steve Harvey called it out by name. "That's a good answer." He did not say it the elaborate way, the exaggerated way. He said it the flat, sincere way of someone noting a fact. Sophie received it the same way, and Sunyi, when she was given the opportunity to play, gave 3 answers in a row that all hit the board. After the third one, she turned to Steve Harvey and said, "See." He said, "I see." She said, "Good." The audience loved her entirely. The Park family won the main game. They went to fast money. Jenny went first and gave 5 answers that hit with the methodical accuracy of a software engineer. Clean, precise, optimized, exactly right. Her score was 143 points. James went second. He answered the 5 questions with the same decisive speed he brought to every other moment of the afternoon. No deliberation, no second guessing, just the direct, confident answer of a man who has been trusting his instincts for long enough to know they are reliable. 4 of his 5 answers landed in the top 2 positions. The family's combined score was 297 points. The Park family had won $20,000. The audience response when the score appeared was the kind that comes from a room that has traveled somewhere together and is releasing the journey along with the celebration. Steve Harvey handed James the check and looked at him for a moment and said, "Your mother is something else." James said, "I know, she always has been." Steve looked at Sunyi, who was watching the check with the expression of a woman calculating something. He asked her what she was going to do with the money. She said she was going to buy a new refrigerator because hers had been making a noise for 2 years that she did not trust. James looked at her. She said, "What? It makes a noise." The audience laughed. Steve Harvey said that was the most practical answer to that question he had received in recent memory. Sunya said that practical was how you got to 46 years in a country and had a son who was a dentist and a daughter-in-law who was an engineer and grandchildren at Berkeley and doing well in high school, and that she had found it worked better than the alternative. Steve Harvey said he was going to need her to come back on the show every year. She said she would consider it depending on the scheduling. The episode aired 5 weeks later. The clip of Steve's response, the specific, unhurried, careful way he had named what the question was doing, the list of individuals he had offered against the category that had been reached for, the invitation to look past the first thing to the things underneath, circulated through Asian American communities, and beyond in the particular way that things circulate when they address something that has been felt but rarely named in that specific language. The comment sections were notable. Not for anger, or not only for anger, but for the specific, relieved quality of people who had been hearing versions of that question their entire lives and were seeing it named in a public space as what it actually was. Not curiosity, not innocence, but the specific failure of vision that happens when a person stops at the surface of another human being and decides that the surface is the person. Second-generation Asian Americans wrote about the experience of growing up in families that had been subject to this particular kind of erasure. The way it sat differently from overt hostility. The way it was harder to address because it came packaged as innocent. The way the person asking it always seemed genuinely puzzled when their question landed badly. First-generation immigrants wrote about it from a different angle, about the decades of being reduced to a category in a country they had given everything to be part of, and about the specific exhaustion of that reduction, and about what it meant to see it named plainly rather than allowed to pass. Teachers wrote about using the clip in classrooms, in discussions about implicit bias, about the difference between curiosity and assumption, about what it means to actually see another person rather than the idea of them. Daniel wrote about the experience in an essay for a campus publication at Berkeley. He wrote about the specific phenomenon of being 20 years old and having a relationship with that question, having encountered it often enough to have developed an entire internal apparatus for receiving and processing it, while also being able to watch it be named and addressed in a public space in a way that externalized something that had, until that point, been managed entirely internally. He wrote about the difference between absorbing something alone and having someone else in the room acknowledge that the thing happened. He said the acknowledgement did not undo the original thing. He said it did something else, something that was its own kind of useful, which was to make him feel that the room he was standing in had decided to be honest about what had just occurred in it. He said that felt, in a way he was still working out the full meaning of, like being seen. Not by the question which had failed to see him, by the response which had insisted on his specificity in the face of the questions generalizing. Sophie went back to high school. She told her best friend about the taping the following day. Her best friend, who was Japanese-American, said, "Did he say, how do you tell them apart?" Sophie said yes. Her best friend said she had been hearing that for her entire life. Sophie said she knew. They sat with that for a moment, then they went to class. James went back to his practice. In the week after the episode aired, he had 3 patients, unconnected to each other, from different backgrounds, who had watched the episode separately and independently, who mentioned it in the context of their appointments. 2 of them were Asian American patients who said something quiet and specific about having seen it. One was a white patient who said she had watched it with her teenage daughter and that they had spent an hour afterward talking about it, and that the conversation had been hard and useful and that she was glad it had happened. James said he was glad too. He said it sincerely. He said it as a person who had spent his career in a room with one patient at a time, learning that the most important thing you could do for another human being was to be fully present to the specific, irreducible, particular person in front of you. He said that was not complicated. He said people just needed to remember to do it. Soon you got her refrigerator. It did not make a noise. She reported this development to her son with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose assessment of a situation has been validated by events, which was a feeling she was familiar with. She continued to be entirely herself in every room she entered, which she had been doing for 74 years, and which she had no intention of changing on anyone's account. What this story is about, at the center of it, under the game show and the buzzer and the $20,000, is something that most people who belong to any group that has been reduced to a category have experienced, and that most people who have never been reduced that way have witnessed and perhaps not known how to respond to. It is the specific erasure of individuality that happens when a group becomes, in someone's mind, primarily a group, when the individual standing in front of you becomes, before you have looked carefully, a representative of a type rather than a person. It is not the loudest kind of prejudice. It does not announce itself with heat or hostility. It arrives as a question. It arrives as innocent curiosity. And it lands as what it actually is, which is the failure to see the specific consequential failure of not looking past the first thing you notice to the person who is actually there. Steve Harvey looked. He saw James and Jenny and Daniel and Sophie and Sunyi specifically and individually, and he said their names in effect in the sentence where he described what each of them was. He said, "This one built a practice. This one solves hard problems. This one impressed me. This one made me laugh. This one told the truth in 4 words. He returned them their individuality in the only way that actually works, which is to actually see them, to look at them as the specific, particular, irreplaceable human beings they are, rather than the instance of a category. It took 30 seconds. It cost him nothing. It mattered to the people on that stage and to everyone watching more than he probably knew. The survey does not have a category for that. There is no board that reveals it. But it is the number 1 answer. It has always been the number 1 answer. See the person in front of you. That is the whole thing. That is all of it. See the person. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about how often you stop at the surface of people who are different from you, or if it made you think about the times you have been reduced to a category rather than seen as yourself, sit with that. And then do something with it. Look at the person in front of you. Actually look. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of this story moved you, because this community pays attention to each other in the comments, and your voice here is part of what makes this space worth coming back to. And if you are not already with us, subscribe right now, because every single week we come back with stories exactly like this one. Stories about the people who get looked through and who deserve to be looked at. Stories about what it means to see someone. And stories about the moments when someone with a microphone says, clearly and in front of everyone, "Look again. Look at who is actually there. We will see you in the next one."